Hello, my name is Andy and I am the Village Idiot. I'm armed with a car and a GoPro and an unhealthy amount of time on my hands. I'm using that time to attempt to visit every civil parish in England. You're watching the East Riding of Yorkshire series. Together with the unparished city of Hull, it forms the county of the same name. There's 172 parishes here. Which one are we in today? Now, we have a saying in this country, it goes along the lines of it's not what you know, it's who you know. And thanks to Trevor Halstead, right here, the man who sponsors a lot of my videos. I have a bike for this episode for Easington and Spurn Point. It's a very fetching pink colour, but it'll get me down Spurn, won't it, Trevor?
It will get you down Spurn Point from one end to the other, no problem at all.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Welcome to the parish of Easington. Here's my disclaimer for people who may be watching me for the first time. I say things as I would in my native accent and dialect. As a result, I may not pronounce things in the same way as the locals do. Remember, I'm a visitor. It's impossible to know everything. Leave me a comment, spin me a like and bash that subscribe button. Let's get to today's parish video. Easington, farm of Essie's people. Welcome to the end of the East Riding. Don't worry, there are still 39 more to go after this, but this is literally the county's answer to Land's End. This is Easington, which was one of the most complicated parishes to cover in the entire county. It consists of a main village, Easington itself, and a whole host of smaller settlements. However, a lot of those other settlements no longer exist. Before coastal erosion had its way out here, Easington Parish included places called Turmarr, Hoton, Northorpe, Dimlington, Old Kilnsea and Ravenser. These villages have been lost to the ever-encroaching sea, some having disappeared as early as 1400. Dimlington's name though still lives on thanks to a pair of Easington streets and one of the 4 gas terminals that dominate the coastline to the north of the village. 2 other settlements still survive though. One of them is Out Newton, which is just a couple of farms, but the other one has one of the East Riding's most well-known landmarks. That would be Kilnsea, the last civilization of any kind before the land becomes a spit and stretches out into the Humber estuary as the Spurn Heritage Coast. At 4 miles long, walking it would have been ridiculous, so I got myself a bike. I must be mad. Keep watching to see how I got on. We begin this fairly short walk around the main village at Easington Youth Club, right at the end of Beck Lane. This is really the only recreational facility the village has, featuring, as it does, a playground. Easington used to have a playing field, but that's now occupied by a football club. Beck Lane is a narrow dead end with terraces, although there is a small cul-de-sac along here with some newer properties. It runs from the centre of the village, known as the Square, which has long been Easington's main focal point. At the end of the road we come to the Easington Community Hall. This is the village hall, and in much the same way as usual, it's frequented by various local groups and it's available to hire. I couldn't find a date for its construction, but you can probably tell it's very modern. Outside the hall is the local bus stop. Easington is served by the number 71 to Withensea, and the village is that route's southern terminus. If it tried to go much further, well, it would get wet. And here we have the square, a central area which is effectively a big car park. Overlooking the central square is the church dedicated to All Saints. It stands on a mound and dates back to Norman times originally. That said, it's had a fair few additions over the centuries. It has a 12th century north aisle, a 13th century south aisle, a 14th century clerestory and west tower, and a 15th century chancel. It's the church they just couldn't stop building, it seems. Set into the wall of the north aisle is an early English doorway that was brought here from Birstall Priory when the monastery sank into the Humber due to coastal erosion. Leaving the churchyard, we're now out onto South Church Side, a terrace street which twists its way onto the High Street. Now at this point, had I looked to the right, I'd have seen what's believed to be the oldest building in the village, apart from the church. On your screens now is a picture of the Tithe Barn, a 14th century thatched building which is the last example of its kind anywhere in Holderness. Until the 1980s, the barn was used for hosting plays and the occasional wedding. Before that, it was used as a war museum. In 1987, the barn was granted a Grade 2 listing status. Next, we have the village school. Easington has had a school since 1860, but the one you see here is not the original. This one opened in 1992 when the first school, which we'll see later on Dimlington Road, was closed. The rest of the High Street is residential. It runs south towards a bend before becoming Humberside Lane, a dead end that goes all the way to the Humber estuary. There are some pretty big houses down here as well as a farm or two. And speaking of farms, there's one in particular that's of interest in Easington. Let's go there next. This is Low Farm, which is the home ground of the local football team, Easington United AFC. Formed in 1947 as Easington Football and Cricket Club, the club spent its formative years in the now defunct South Holderness League. In 1954 they joined the East Riding County League, and in 1958 Easington United AFC came into its own following a split with the cricket team. They're one of the oldest grassroots football clubs in Holderness, and they're nicknamed the East Enders because of their location. It's got nothing to do with Phil Mitchell. It's up Beck Street next as we start to head back towards the square. On the way we pass an old primitive Methodist chapel on Back Street. Chapels were all over the place out here at one time. Several of the outlying settlements had one, including Out Newton, but that one's now lost to the sea. Back Street rounds a tight bend as we make for one of the two village pubs next, the White Horse. This is a late 19th century pub which still has its original interior. It's known locally as a Twitcher's pub because it's not uncommon to find birdwatchers frequenting it. We're back to the square again. There's another of those hidden Holderness boards on this little building. At the edge of the square there's a former grocer's shop and post office. It was owned by R.H. Webster and was established in 1877. It sits on the site of Overton Hall, a large manorial type structure that was in existence in the 1600s. There used to be at least 3 shops in this village, but as with many rural out-of-the-way places, they've now disappeared. Seaside Road is where we are now, which runs east towards the North Sea and Easington Beach. Now let's check out the area to the north of the square by using Vickers Lane. This is a quieter road mainly because it's sort of a dead end. It's not entirely because there is a private lane that links it to Dimlington Road. Otherwise it ends up at one of the North Sea gas terminals. Halfway up the road you can use a short linkway to Turmarr Villas. Turmarr was one of the settlements that was once in the parish of Easington before coastal erosion swept it away. There were several others too, and some of them disappeared as far back as 1400. The old school, built in 1860 and now a private house, greets us as we reach Dimlington Road. Dimlington was another of the villages that used to be within the parish before the sea swallowed it up. Here in Easington though, the memory of the place is kept alive by way of 2 streets, Dimlington Road and Dimlington Bungalows. In addition, one of the gas terminals to the north of the village is also named Dimlington. Hoton, Northorpe, Old Kilnsea and Ravenser are the other 4 which have too met a watery fate. We're now at the main junction in the middle of the village, and if we continue south we come to what's known as Blacksmith's Corner. This features the War Memorial. This was erected in 1998 and it's made of cobblestone boulders and brick with a flagpole. Next to it, there's another memorial, this one for an old windmill. A mill was first recorded in Easington in 1260 and a mill was operational until the late 1920s. It was finally dismantled in the 1960s. Rounding Blacksmith's Corner means passing Blacksmith Cottage. That's this house with the signboard. Up next is the second pub, the Marquis of Granby, which sits in the shadow of the church on North Church side. This is the larger of the two pubs and is geared more towards food than the White Horse. This also offers some B&B type accommodation too. There are two landmarks left. The first one is an empty old phone box, unusually red for the East Riding. Then there's a row of houses on the left hand side, which are the Coastguard cottages, which sport a tower and a clock at one end. In a moment, we'll see something else that's related to these. Okay, so we've successfully made it around Easington, and to be honest with you, if that was the only thing in this parish, that would be a nice little episode, wouldn't it? However, Easington is definitely not the only thing in this one, because we have to go to a place now called Kilnsea, which is to the south of Easington. Now that's a long linear village, and we're going to drive through it. We're going to end at a pub, but the road doesn't stop there. Before we leave Easington, there's a couple more landmarks. On the left here, you'll see a house with an unusual monument by its gate. It's a former Coastguard tower and it dates from 1867. After the tower, the road splits into two pieces. One heads south to Kilnsea, the other goes to Easington Beach, a stretch of shingle popular with walkers. As with many other Holderness villages, the coastline here is ever changing. As you can see, the road comes to an abrupt stop where some of it has been washed away by coastal erosion. The road to the beach only really has one other feature, and that would be a caravan park or two, because anywhere that's near the sea is bound to have one of those. This is the Easington Beach Caravan Park, parts of which, it has to be said, are perilously close to the cliff edge. Anchoring the site is the Long Beach Club, the building to the right of your screens now. Now we're heading down Firth Home Road towards Kilnsea, which has lost and is still losing land to the sea. The annual loss varies between 1 and 3 yards annually. When it was recorded in the Domesday Book, Kilnsea was several miles from the sea and its dwellings were on a hill. Old Kilnsea was swept away, and effectively this is New Kilnsea. Before the loss of the old village, it had several alehouses, shops and even a school. Between 1826 and 1831, its church, dedicated to St Helen, fell into the waves. To replace it, a new church was built thanks to funding from Trinity House, to this day the body which holds responsibility for the construction of lighthouses in the UK. The new church, built in the 1860s, still stands today, but it was declared redundant in 1993, and ever since that point, Kilnsea has officially been a hamlet. After the new village was created, it never got any larger than about 30 houses, though it did manage to retain 2 public houses, the Bluebell and the Crown and Anchor. Modern features also include the Kilnsea Wetlands Nature Reserve, which provides waders from the Humber Mudflats with a place to roost at high tide. Kilnsea is perhaps best known for having a piece of military infrastructure, which we've so far never come across. This is the Kilnsea Sound Mirror, which was used during World War I. Sound mirrors go by different names. Some people call them acoustic mirrors or whisper dishes, and when they're found in pairs, they're referred to as whisper galleries. Their purpose was to detect incoming enemy aircraft by listening for the sound of their engines. They acted as early warning devices and had a pipe known as a collector head in front of them, which held a microphone. They were mostly ineffective though. As the speed of the average aircraft increased during the 1930s, most were already too close to engage by the time they'd been detected by a sound mirror. Some of these can be found on the south coast, but to find one on the east coast is much rarer. Kilnsea Sound Mirror stands at 4.5 metres high and it's on private land. It can clearly be seen though from the road into Kilnsea, and can also be seen from a public footpath which runs close to its site on the other side of Kilnsea Wetlands. Now, the road we've just driven down is the one straight ahead of us, and to the left is Spurn Point, and that is where I'm going. Now, you can't drive down Spurn Point anymore. You used to be able to, but these days they've stopped you from doing that, so you either have to walk it or you have to use a bike. And I've got a bike because you saw at the beginning of this episode me get this bike from Trevor Halstead at Gainsborough Cycles. So we're going to set that up and we're going to cycle down Spurn Point. Now it's a long way, a very, very long way. It's longer than it looks on the map. To walk it, it would take you an hour from this point to the other end and another hour back. Now, of course, I don't have that amount of time, which is why I have the bike. I should, in theory, be able to do the whole thing inside an hour. Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. And of course, this weather is not the best, is it? But, you know, it is what it is. I've got a raincoat on. I've got plenty of, you know, warm clothing on, so I should be all right, I suppose. It's about 4 miles from this point here to the end of Spurn Point, and then of course 4 miles back again. So 8 miles on the bike. Let's go. Just before we get moving, I should stress that here I opted to use my GoPro's head strap because attempting to carry the tripod on the bike would have been an impossible task. I'd never before used the head strap, so I had absolutely no idea what this footage was going to be like. So here we go then down the Spurn Heritage Coast. The first half a mile is a simple enough road, but soon after passing the brand new Spurn Discovery Centre on the right, it becomes a concrete causeway. Spurn is what's known to geographers as a spit, a long, thin stretch of land where all the eroded material from further up the coast is deposited. This happens thanks to a phenomenon known as longshore drift. As the North Sea's energy begins to diminish as it meets the Humber, it can no longer sweep the material it carries along with it, meaning it washes ashore. The result is Spurn, the flimsiest, narrowest piece of land anywhere in the UK. Whilst the sea has created this, it's begun to destroy its own work. Okay, so I hopped off the bike here just for a second because part of this route you have to cycle on a beach, sort of a beach anyway. So you can see the North Sea to the left there, the wind farm in the distance, and it's also on the right as well. It's more the Humber on the right though, isn't it? So here's the beach coming up. You can see that the road kind of stops and you have to go along the beach for a bit, but the road does rejoin on the other side to get down to the nature reserve. So that's effectively where we're going. Look how rough that sea is today. It's amazing, isn't it? Right, let's carry on. The road used to run all the way to the end. It's now in 2 pieces thanks to a tidal surge which washed away a huge chunk. This area is known as the breach or the washover zone. I'm not gonna lie folks, this is probably the hardest thing I've ever done. I'll be honest with you. The lighthouses are still quite a way away in the distance over there, but having to push this bike along the beach is really difficult. There's no way I can cycle on it. It's just too difficult to do. But like I said, when we get towards that cliff you can see over there, the road reappears and we should be okay for the last push towards the lighthouses and towards the nature reserve at the other end, he said, hopefully. Okay, we've made it to the road again. That is the hardest thing, let me tell you, the hardest thing I've ever done on this channel, pushing this bike along the beach. I've got to do it on the way back as well yet. Let's continue then, and let's find those lighthouses. Before the tidal surge, cars were allowed to drive all the way to the end of Spurn. Right. Now though, with no road in the washover zone, visitors face an arduous journey to the other end, either by foot or by bike. The causeway was built during World War I and it's weathered many a storm in its time, but during the surge in 2013, part of it was ripped away in less than an hour. It's frightening just how much damage Mother Nature can do. At high tide, the washover zone can become inundated with water, effectively turning this part of Spurn into an island. Thankfully though, visitors are still allowed. Look to the right here and you can see what looks like a lagoon. Spurn isn't straight, it's a gentle curve which bends westwards into the Humber. That's all to do with the direction of the prevailing wind. As the spit formed with the eroded material from the coast deposited on the outer arc, a salt marsh consisting of mud and silt has formed on the inside of the curve due to the low energy in the waters of the Humber. Geographers call this kind of phenomenon a sheltered estuary. The deposited material has formed sand dunes right the way along Spurn. These have been colonised by vegetation, particularly marram grass, which is the greenery you can see all around you. It's not a desolate wasteland either. Most of it is designated as a nature reserve, most notably the area at the very far end. It's not uncommon to see plenty of bird watchers on Spurn, and that's why the pubs in Easington and Kilnsea do so well for themselves. As well as a road, Spurn also used to have a railway, parts of which can still be seen. You may have noticed rails in the road a couple of times already. Conventional engines were not used here though. Instead, unusual sail bogies were used, as well as more conventional light railway equipment. After about 3.5 miles of walking and cycling, the first real interesting landmarks come into view: the lighthouses. Spurn has had a few lighthouses over the centuries. The earliest reference to one goes back to 1427. The ones standing here today are much more modern. The black and white lighthouse on your screens now dates from 1895. It's not used anymore since it was decommissioned in 1985. It does open for tours though at certain times of year. Initially oil lit, it was converted to electricity in 1941 to enable the light to be lit briefly when requested by ships. It was built to replace two former lighthouses which were built by John Smeaton in 1767, known as the High Light and the Low Light. Smeaton's High Light was a 90-foot tower which remained in use until the new one was built. The Low Light suffered severe problems with maintenance, and within a short time it had been washed away by the sea. A series of temporary replacements were used in the years that followed until a more solid lighthouse designed by James Walker was constructed in 1852 under the supervision of engineer Henry Norris. Unlike its predecessor, the Low Light was built on the Humber estuary side of Spurn rather than on the seaward side. That structure still stands today, although its lantern has been replaced by a water tank. We've now reached the very end. This area is known as Spurn Head, which covers about 280 acres above high water. It's been owned by the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust since 1960 and forms part of the Humber Flats, Marshes and Coast Special Protection Area. It's here where you'll come across something you might not have expected: houses. You see, since 1810, Spurn Head has had a lifeboat station. Owing to the remote location, houses for the lifeboat crew and their families were added a few years later. By the 1870s, a room in the High Lighthouse was being used as a chapel for the small residential community who lived here, serving the keepers, the coastguardsmen and the fishermen. However, nobody lives here now permanently, given that Spurn is effectively a tidal island. The jetty which you can see here was for launching the lifeboats. An inspection in February 2023 revealed this had structural issues, and as a result, the station was moved to Grimsby. There are wartime relics down here too. During the First World War, two coastal artillery 9.2-inch batteries were added at either end of Spurn Head, with 4 and 4.7-inch quick-firing guns in between. The northern ones are particularly interesting, as coastal erosion has partially toppled them onto the beach, revealing the size of their concrete foundations. We would have been able to see them in a bit more detail, but as I was soon to find out, we couldn't actually go any further than here. We have travelled though, almost to the very end of the East Riding. Well, it looks like, people, that's as far as we can go, because there's a fence now blocking the road off. I don't think we're that far from the very end, actually, to be honest with you. I'll just have a quick check of my phone, because this will tell me definitively how far away the end of Spurn Point is. It's just a nature reserve at the very, very far end, but it looks like this is as far as we can go, because there's a barrier there. I suppose you could sort of, you know, walk through it or over it or whatever, but I'm not going to do that. Yeah, we're virtually at the end. If you look here, look, I don't know whether you can see this, but the blue blob on my Google Maps, can you see that? Hopefully you can, because I can't see a thing because the GoPro's on my head. It's almost right at the end. So we've almost made it all the way to the Land's End, if you like, of the East Riding of Yorkshire, which is pretty good. I think we've done very well there. And now I've got to take myself back. So this should be easier, in fact, on the way back, because most of it will be cycling downhill as opposed to uphill, which is what it has been up to now. What a beautiful place, and how interesting it is. Fabulous. Despite now not being accessible by car to visitors, I'm sure you will have noticed some vehicles down here. To get to Spurn Head, they have to drive along the beach. Presumably, they belong to members of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. You have to make sure if you're coming here that you don't visit at high tide, as it can cut you off from the mainland. The Yorkshire Wildlife Trust have installed a high tide shelter on Spurn Head though, so if the worst does happen, you do have somewhere safe to wait it out. And you don't need to park at the Bluebell pub either, like I did. Instead, for a small fee, you can park at the Spurn Discovery Centre, which was opened in 2018 by Simon King. The centre's construction was initially met with criticism from the locals because there was a perceived feeling that Spurn was becoming commercialised. Well, I think it needs it though. Spurn once featured on the television programme Seven Natural Wonders as one of the wonders of Yorkshire. Having now seen it all, from beginning to end, in all its glory, a wonder it most certainly is. To finish with, we're taking a look at the North Sea gas terminals. It might be easy to think there's only one of these when seen from afar, but there are in fact four. They just happen to be built so close to each other. Two of the plants are operated by BP Centrica Storage, which processes and stores gas offshore, and another is owned by Gasco, who operate the Langeled pipeline between Norway and the UK. Collectively, these are sometimes referred to as the Easington gas terminals. Until the 1960s, these were not even thought of. It was 1965 when gas was first discovered under the North Sea by the first ever British oil rig, the Sea Gem. It found the West Sole gas field, which lies 42 miles east of the Humber. It's a faulted dome covering an area of around 36 square miles, and it lies at a depth of 9,000 feet below the surface. The natural gas within it is mainly methane. Gas was first produced from it in March 1967, and that same year BP opened the first of the four terminals. Dimlington is the largest site of the four and has the control room for all the North Sea fields that ship gas to Easington. All the sites are a considerable fire hazard, so they have large water reservoirs for firefighting containing between 1 million and 3 million litres of water each. The terminals are also protected by Ministry of Defence police officers. As we drive away from Easington, we pass a tower with two bright red lights atop it. I have no idea what this is. There seems to be nothing out there about it, so whether it's anything to do with the gas terminals or whether it's something else entirely, I don't know. Anyway, that's been Easington, but before we move on to the next one, I took full advantage of the darkness which had fallen pretty quickly by recording this 20-second segment along Patterington High Street on my way back to Hull. Look at the Christmas lights, aren't they magnificent? Next week we'll be in another of the East Riding's towns, arguably the most historic one yet this side of Hull. See you there. Thanks for watching this video, folks. Don't forget to like this episode if you haven't already. It really makes a difference with YouTube. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, and give us a share too if you've got friends who'd like it. You can find all the links to my social media accounts below, as well as my Buy Me a Coffee page where you can donate to the channel. Also, if you've enjoyed this episode, have a look at some more videos in this series. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as the Village Idiot, and I'm out.